Psalm 46, 46th Psalm. We'll read the entire Psalm, 11 verses. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore, because of what just said, will not we fear, though the earth be removed, and though the mountains be carried into the midst of the sea, though the waters thereof roar and be troubled, though the mountains shake with the swelling thereof, Selah. There is a river, the streams whereof shall make glad the city of God, the holy place of the tabernacles of the Most High. God is in the midst of her, and she shall not be moved. God shall help her, and that right early. The heathen raged, the kingdoms were moved. He uttered his voice, the earth melted. The Lord of hosts is with us, the God of Jacob is our refuge, Selah. Come, behold the works of the Lord, what desolations he hath made in the earth. Maketh wars to cease unto the end of the earth. He breaketh the bow, cutteth the spear in sunder, he burneth the chariot in the fire. Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the heathen. I will be exalted in the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge, Selah. You'll notice the inscription of the psalm. It's probably in most of your Bibles. To the chief musician for the sons of Korah. So it was submitted to the chief musician for the sons of Korah, which was a Levitical family of singers, and it is a song upon alamoth, some type of musical instrument, and I'm sure you could probably look that up and find out what it is. But the author, the circumstances, the specific time of the psalm, none of these are specified. It is a psalm that has a very definite arrangement. It consists of 3 stanzas. Each stanza is marked with the word Selah. And we see that in verse 3, verse 7, and verse 11. Selah, as you know, is a musical pause. But for you and I, it's a place for us to pause and to contemplate and give serious thought to what has been said. In the first stanza, verses 1 through 3, the sufficiency of God is presented. So you have the fact of his stability, the fact of our stability, and then the word Selah. Think about it. In verses 4 through 7, you have the second stanza, which is basically the security of God is presented, and that he is our comfort, and then you have Selah. In the third stanza, verse 8 through 11, you have the supremacy of God, and that he is our deliverance, and then Selah. So the theme, the subject of the psalm, is the overwhelming fact of God. And that is established in the first 2 words of the psalm. God is. God is. And that becomes the central fact, the main idea of the 46th Psalm. God is. Such should be our life. God is. The nature of the psalm is one of praise to God. It consists of worship, adoration, reverence for God, faith, and assurance in God. And again, such should be our life. The tone of the psalm is one of certainty. God is. And that's declared several other places as well in this 46th psalm. It's one of certainty. It's one of confidence. It's one of joy and calm. And such should be the tone of our life. So this 46th psalm, whoever the writer is living his life focused upon God. Whoever the writer is, he's living his life impacted by God. He has faith in God concerning the daily happenings of life. It is the writing of one living his life enjoying God. And he is refreshed by God. It's the writing of someone who's very much aware of God. And that's in the midst of all the happenings of life. It's the writing of someone who is reflecting upon God. So in this psalm, we see one who is living his life in the reality of God. I want to speak this morning on God, the focus. One of the biggest problems of the Christian life is an improper focus. One of the biggest struggles of the Christian life is maintaining and keeping a proper focus. It's very easy with all the happenings of life and all the various circumstances to lose proper focus. God, the focus. We'll be okay if we focus upon God. Focus upon God. Now, as you read this psalm, no doubt it was extremely relevant when it was written, and its relevance still remains today for you and I. The more we realize and the more we are aware of the truth and the reality of this psalm, the happier we will be, the more useful we will be, the more fruitful we will become. We desperately need to live in the reality of this psalm. We need to experience every day this psalm. Again, the focus is God. And therefore we find assurance, we find comfort, we find strength, we find security, we find peace, we find refreshment, we find victory, encouragement, conviction, energy for our soul. It's a psalm that ought to embolden and strengthen the faith and resolve of every child of God. But again, the key is focus. The key is our perspective. So the first thing we want to do is consider the setting, some of the circumstances of the psalm, some of the possible circumstances of the psalm. And though we are not told the specific circumstances that were occurring when the psalm was written, there are several statements that paint the picture or paint the setting of the psalm. For example, verse 1, God is referred to as a present tense refuge. A refuge is indicative of storm, danger, and need. He is also referred to as present tense strength, indicative of present tense weakness and inability. He is also referred to as a very present help, suggestive of a very urgent need. You will also see the word trouble there in verse 1, suggesting a tight place, a squeezed pathway, suggestive of some kind of pressure, some kind of distress, some problems, some difficulties, some inconveniences, some trials, some heartaches, some griefs, some suffering, some burdens. And it is in trouble, conveying the idea, again, of being surrounded and fenced in by these things. The specifics of the trouble are not stated, but as we all know, trouble can come in great variety. It can be in the realm of the physical, it can be in the realm of the emotional, it can be a realm of the spiritual. It can be all of those at the same time. It can vary in degree. It can vary in duration. Not all trouble is the same. Not all trouble lasts the same amount of time. So it can vary in degree. It can vary in duration. In verse 2, the psalmist says, "Therefore will we not fear," suggesting that it was a time of fear. It was a time of angst, a time of anxiety, perhaps a time of dread and panic and uneasiness. And then in verses 2 and 3, the psalmist paints a picture of the severity of the trouble and the fear, and he says "though" 4 times, showing that even if this happens, not necessarily happening at that time, but it could happen. So he draws our attention in verses 2 and 3, he draws our attention to 3 images. He mentions the earth, he mentions the mountains, he mentions the sea. And then he proceeds to illustrate that the way trouble can come, and the severity of the trouble. In verses 2 and 3, there are 4 illustrations marked by the word "though." And each illustration speaks of great upheaval, speaks of a time of great disturbance. Each illustration conveys the idea of pandemonium, something very chaotic, very drastic, and unpleasant change. First thing he says is, "though the earth be removed." Perhaps talking about some kind of earthquake. Though the earth be removed. This is something that is mysterious, something that is threatening. If the earth is being removed, guess what? There's nowhere to go. So this is a trouble you can't get away from. There's nowhere to go. And then he mentions, "and though the mountains be carried into the midst of the sea." The mountains, that which is firm, that which is solid and stable, being brought to ruin. They just fall into the sea. And then he says, "and though the waters thereof," that is, the waters of the sea, "roar and be troubled," though they be agitated to a life-threatening degree. And then lastly, "and though the mountains shake or vibrate and totter with the swelling thereof." So we see the earth removed, the mountains falling into the sea raging, and the remaining mountains shaking This is a crisis. This is cataclysmic. It's a disaster. It's a calamity. It paints the picture of everything spinning out of control. Everything falling apart. And we all get to those times where we think everything's spinning out of control. Everything's falling apart. And those are dire straits. What we read in verse 2 and 3 is horrifying stuff. I mean, the earth begins to be removed. The mountains begin to fall into the sea. And the remaining mountains begin to shake. This is horrifying stuff. This is scary stuff. These are things that are bigger than man. These are things that are beyond the control of man. In verse 5, speaking of Jerusalem, there are the words, "She shall not be moved," indicative of a present threat. In verse 6, the heathen raged, speaking of their agitation, speaking of their fury and their wrath and their resentment toward God and their resentment toward God's people. The heathen raged. And you have the words, "the kingdoms were moved," conveying the idea of violence and overthrow. In verse 10, God says, "I will be exalted among the heathen. I will be exalted in the earth," suggesting that it was a time when God was being discredited, when God was being dishonored. So these are the circumstances of the psalm. But now think about the focus and the emphasis that the psalmist has in these circumstances. As you read the 46th Psalm, it is not hard to see that the circumstances of the psalm are not the focus. They are not the emphasis. They are not the theme. The focus, the emphasis, the theme of the psalm, again, is established in the first two words. God is. God is. Why doesn't the psalmist begin with the storm? Why doesn't he begin with the danger and the need? I mean, God is our refuge. But he doesn't begin with the storm or the danger or the need. He begins with God is. And I'll tell you something, where we begin is where we put the emphasis. That's where we put the emphasis. If you begin with the trouble, that's where you're putting the emphasis. But he begins with God is. God is our strength. The other side of that is there is weakness and inability of man. But he doesn't begin with the weakness and inability of man. He begins with God is. There's the word trouble. But he doesn't begin with trouble. He begins with God is. And as you read through the psalm, you'll notice that the name God occurs 7 times. The name Lord occurs 3 times. All capital letters, Jehovah. The title Most High occurs 1 time. The personal pronoun he, referring to him, 5 times. And the personal pronoun I, referring to him 3 times. That's 19 references to God. Who's the focus? God. Yes, there's trouble going on in the psalm. But God is the focus. God is the emphasis. The psalmist directs our attention away from the catastrophic happenings of verses 2 and 3 to the absoluteness of God. Again in verse 2 and 3, though the earth be removed, though the mountains be carried into the midst of the sea, and though the waters thereof roar and be troubled, and though the mountains shake with the swelling thereof. So again, you have the earth removed, the mountains carried into the sea is troubled, the remaining mountains are shaking, but that is not the emphasis. That is not the focus. The focus is in the midst of all these things, God is. And He is our refuge. And He is our strength. And He is a very present help in trouble. And in verse 4, He is the Most High. And then in verse 5, God is in the midst. And God shall help. The focus and the emphasis. God is. That's the focus. The focus and emphasis is the fact, the existence, the reality, and the certainty that God is never threatened. No matter what, God is. God is. And He is our refuge. He is our strength. He is a very present help in trouble. And He is the Most High. In other words, He is the most prominent. He is the most influential. He is the most powerful. So therefore, that's where our focus, that's where the emphasis needs to be. Verse 6, the heathen raged. The kingdoms were moved. But again, this is not the focus. The raging of the heathen is not the focus. Kingdoms falling is not the focus. But notice what it says. He uttered His voice. The focus is God. The focus is upon what God has done. The attention is upon the activity of God. And then in verse 5 you come to God shall. Again, the focus is God. In verses 8 and 9, the psalmist directs our attention to the activity of God in the past. He mentions wars or battles and struggles. He mentions the bow. He mentions the spear. He mentions the chariot. All emblems of the enemy power and force. But the focus is not upon the chariots or spears or the bow. The focus is upon what God did with those things. So again, though the mountains be carried into the midst of the sea, and though the waters thereof roar and be troubled, and though the mountains shake with the swelling thereof, and though the heathen raged and the kingdoms were moved, this is not the focus. This is not the emphasis. But in verse 7 we read, the Lord of hosts is. There's the focus. The focus is upon who God is. The Lord of hosts. That is a title that occurs 235 times in the Word of God. The Lord of hosts. Lord God of hosts occurs 28 times. The teaching of those phrases is God is in sovereign control. Oh, God's people, they're good at making it sound like they're spiritual. They're torn to pieces about politics and everything else that's going on. And they'll say, but God's in control. Well, why didn't you start with that? Because that's not your focus. That's not your emphasis. And listen to them talk. Oh, they'll talk for hours upon the troubles and the circumstances. How long do they talk on the sovereignty of God? Very little. They'll throw it in there because, I want you to think I'm spiritual. But that's not the focus. That needs to be our focus. That needs to be our focus. I don't watch the news anymore. None of you do, because there is no such thing as news. I don't watch the commentary on the news anymore. Because to do so, I lose my focus very quickly. And I'm better off if I don't do that. And so are you. Well, how do you know what's going on? I read, but I don't do that a whole lot either. If it begins to interfere with your focus, you begin to look at things through whatever lens you want to look through it, you got the wrong lens. The only lens we need to be looking at things through is God. 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 Where's our focus? God's in control. Yes, He is. Psalm 103, verse 19, the Lord hath prepared His throne in the heavens, His kingdom ruleth over all. That's true every day. That's true no matter what the circumstances. That is a truth that is seen on every page of this book. He reigns supreme. He has absolute authority and control. He is the Lord of hosts. That is, as such, He protects us. He delivers us. He preserves us. He is the Lord of hosts. That means the battle is His. It's not mine, it's not yours. It's His. And in the 46th Psalm, this Lord of hosts is with us. That needs to be our emphasis. That needs to be our focus. He is with us. And He is with us as our refuge. He is with us as our strength. He is with us as a very present help. He is more present than whatever the circumstances are. He is more present than whatever the happenings are. That's where the focus, that's where the emphasis needs to be. Verse 7, He's also the God of Jacob is. The Lord of hosts is. The God of Jacob is. So in the midst of crisis and disaster, God is the focus. God is the emphasis. He's the God of Jacob. He's the one who can overhaul and transform lives. That's not only so of our life, it's so of every life. He's the God of Jacob is. Reading through the Psalm, we see 6 times it is emphatically declared, God is. Verse 1, God is. Verse 4, we see God is as well. We see in verse 7 and verse 11, 4 more times, the Lord of hosts is, the God of Jacob is. And this is so regardless. Reading through the Psalm, we see that that which appears to be most stable can be shaken, can be destroyed. The heathen may rage. The kingdoms may be removed. But regardless, God is. The fact, the existence, the reality, the certainty of God is never threatened. It's never threatened. No matter what, God is. So the focus and the emphasis is not on what is happening. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying you should be oblivious to what's happening. But that's not to be your focus. That's not to be your emphasis. Regardless of what is happening, God is. And that needs to be our focus. The factor of the psalm, the main factor of the psalm, is not the crisis. It's not the disaster. It's not the calamity. It's not the scary and horrifying stuff. But the focus and the emphasis is the overwhelming fact that God is. You see, where our focus and where our emphasis is, that becomes our identity. That becomes the direction of our life. Are the happenings of life, is that what is to define us? Is that where our identity is to be? Of course not. You read through the psalm, we see one whose his life is impacted by God is. What's your life more impacted by? The news or God? What has more of an impact upon your day? The news or God? What has more of an impact upon your day? What is happening, the circumstances of your life, or God? We need to answer those questions. And we need to answer them honestly. Oh, you might get around to God eventually, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the focus. I'm talking about the main emphasis. Yeah, God's people, they'll eventually get there. It might be 10 o'clock at night before they do, but God's in control. Make sure you throw that in there. God's in control. But is that the emphasis? In most cases, no. The attitude of the psalm is whatever happens, God is. God is. In verses 2 and 3, he's imagining, though, these things happening. And he's saying, if it does happen, God is. God is. He's living his life enjoying God. Does the news of the day rob you of your enjoyment of God? You get so upset, you get so enraged, you get so affected by the news of the day that you don't enjoy God. How can that be right? There's nothing right about it. Reading through the psalm, we see one who has conviction concerning God. He has conviction. He's aware. He's very much aware of who God is. So again, the focus, the emphasis is not what is happening, but regardless of what is happening. God is, and God is who and what He is. So let's make application to ourselves. We live, and the Bible teaches this is the plan of God. We live in a very serious, very pressing, and desperate time, humanly speaking. All around us, I mean everywhere you go, There is that which is broken and shattered. Everywhere you go, there are ruins. Lives are ruined. Everywhere you go, there is upheaval. There's chaos. You don't have to look far. There's failure. There's defeat. There's discouragement. People are tormented. Misery everywhere. Distress. Insurmountable problems. Man has the idea that we solve this problem and that'll end all of our problems. Oh no. Problems are innumerable. Problems are insurmountable. So it is with needs. We live in a time of great turbulence, tumultuous times. But we must not be bogged down and stuck in the times in which we live. We must not get bogged down and stuck in our circumstances. They must not become our focus and our emphasis. But the focus and the emphasis and the theme of our life is to be God is. And He is who He is. And who He is our refuge and our strength and our help. What all that means is He is suitable to our needs. If He is our refuge, our strength, and our help, it means that He is available to us. That needs to be our emphasis. It means that He is accessible. We must not allow our attention to be diverted from the fact that God is. And we live in a world that diverts our attention. Most of God's people come to God's house, supposedly to worship God, but what's on their mind is the news and the happenings of life. You can't worship God that way. Regardless of the circumstances, regardless of the happenings, the circumstances and the happenings are not to define our life. But we're to keep God in view. And that's not easy. That's not easy. That's a struggle. Though the earth be removed, though the mountains be carried into the midst of the sea, though the waters thereof roar and be troubled, and though the mountains shake with the swelling thereof, and though the heathen rage, and though the kingdoms be moved, these must not in our minds, in our thinking, overshadow God. Don't lose sight of God. Whatever the happenings are, whatever the circumstances are, don't lose sight of God. Don't allow the wickedness, and the vileness, and the abomination, and the blasphemy, and the heresy, and the perversion become the main thing. Don't allow them to cloud your vision of who God is. Don't allow the fear. Fear is rampant. Fear is rampant amongst God's people. Oh, they wouldn't admit to it, but it's so. Don't allow the fear and the panic and the anxiety and the irrational behavior of the times get in the way of your focus upon God. Keep God in view. Recognize God. Acknowledge God. Think God. Think God. Whatever the circumstances in your life, think God. Think God. You know, we say something happens, and it's hard to get it out of our minds. Oh, that was reversed. That we think upon God so much we just can't get Him out of our minds. Thank God. Thank God. We must not allow ourselves to get so busy, so caught up, so distracted, so entangled with the affairs of life that we become blind and deaf to God. And that's where many of God's people are. They're so caught up, so entangled with everything else that they're blind and deaf to God. We live in a world, if you live long enough, you will experience darkness. But our focus is to be upon the one who can turn the darkness in the light. Our focus is not to be on the darkness. You just focus and emphasize the darkness, your life is going to become dark. But the emphasis and focus is not that we're oblivious to the darkness, but the emphasis and the focus is upon the one who can turn the darkness to light. We live in a world where we will experience weakness. But our focus is to be upon the one who can bring strength, not upon the weakness. We live in a world where we will experience defeat. But our focus is to be upon the one who can make us victorious. We live in a world where we will experience some chaos. But our focus is to be upon the one who can bring order to the chaos. We live in a world where we will experience turmoil. But our focus needs to be upon the one who can bring peace in turmoil. We live where we will experience some uncertainty. But our focus needs to be upon the one who can bring certainty in the midst of uncertainty. Where is our focus? We live in a world where we will experience some storms, but our focus needs to be upon the one who can bring calm in the storm. We live in a world where we will experience sorrow, but our focus needs to be upon the one who can bring joy in sorrow. And you get my point. We need to have our focus upon the Lord. Where is your focus? Where is your emphasis? You can pretty accurately answer that question. Where do you begin? Where do you begin? Where do your conversations begin? Where do you begin? The psalmist began, God is. God is. That's his focus. Is life in our minds overshadowing God? Or is God overshadowing life? Where is your confidence? Where is your confidence? In the happenings of life? In the government? Or in God? Where is your confidence? Where do we begin? Begin with God, not the problems. I can assure you that if you live long enough, there will be more difficulties. in your life. Perhaps right now you don't have a difficulty in your life. If you live long enough, there'll be more difficulties in your life. Focus upon God, not the difficulty. There will be more troubles. There will be more adversities. There will be more sorrows. There will be more heartaches. Focus upon God. Think God. Move in the direction of God. There will be more temptations. Focus upon God. Think God. Move in the direction of God. There will be more valleys to pass through. There will be some dungeons. There will be some rocky roads on which you will have to walk. There will be some wilderness and desert times. And there will be some obstacles for you to overcome. And there will be more storms to go through. And there will be more giants to encounter. And there will be some more furnaces that you're going to have to walk through. And there's going to be some more droughts, and there's going to be some more challenges that are bigger than you. And there will be more attacks from the enemy. And you will have more steep hills to climb. But focus upon God. Not the valleys, not the dungeons, not the rocky roads, not the wilderness, not the obstacles, not the giants, not the storms. Focus upon God. Start with God. Think God. Move in the direction of God. And you will find assurance. You will find enjoyment of God. Don't lose sight of God. I've said this many times, not here, but you go to a mall, maybe not so much today because they're pretty empty. And you just sit on a bench and watch people. They are miserable. People are so miserable today. People are so angry today. Because they're all focusing on the wrong things. Their worldview is so narrow. Their vision is so narrow. We need to focus upon God. Don't lose sight of God. When troubles come, the first thing you should pray is not, Lord, get me out of this mess. That's usually where God's people begin. But it ought to be, Lord, help me to keep my eyes on you. Help me, Lord, not to lose sight of who you are. That He would always be the subject. That He would always be the theme of our lives. And not the happenings of life. Where is your focus today? I'm not asking you if you eventually get around to God. I imagine you do. That's not what I'm asking. Where is the focus? Where is the emphasis? Where do you start? We need to examine, because it robs God's people of much joy, a wrong focus. It increases our problems. It skews our thought process by just having the wrong focus, the wrong emphasis. So God help us. Let's all stand. Song leader, come, lead us in verse